Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas not a fortnight ago that, suffering from a surfeit of domestic tranquillity, so excessive that it was fain to become fatal, I fled yet again to the club, the Four Steer Beefsteak Club. Man there was fortunate enough to be joined serendipitously by a most illustrious company. William Godwin, philosopher and anarchist extraordinaire; Edmund Burke, that paragon of deliberation and moderation; Edward Gibbon, whose testicular hydrocele unfortunately was again bothering him; and last but not least, that stand-in for the devil himself, John Wilkes. What a welcome assortment of rare gems! As we comfortably settled into our chairs around a broad table, nursing various beverages, I proposed to the assembled company that they vote on a list that I had compiled of the 10 most illustrious individual achievements in all of British history, submitting them to a vote and first asking them to write their own nominations on a piece of paper to put their mind into proper focus. They all genially complied and began thinking and scribbling. While I waited for them to accomplish this task, I took some sips from my glass of Madeira and continued taking slices from my juicy sirloin. When they all had indicated that they had finished, I began. I nominated as the greatest single British achievement, at number 1, numero uno, Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, in which he lays bare the whole mechanism by which the universe operates, giving us his 3 laws of motion and universal gravitation. I fully expected that the assembled company would agree here unanimously, and 3 of the 4 did, with only John Wilkes protesting that Shakespeare's Hamlet should be number 1. I responding that, given John's very amorous inclinations with the ladies, I would have expected him to nominate Romeo and Juliet instead. This brought no end of laughter from the assembled company, and a broad smile as well to John's lips. At number 2, I did agree to Wilkes's promotion of the Bard, putting Hamlet at number 2. Here there were 3 out of 4 convivially agreeing. Gibbon, for his part, disagreeing, however, arguing for Watt's steam engine at number 2. His recommendation brought up the difficult fact, to which we all agreed, that comparing technological against scientific, against artistic, against philosophical achievement is highly problematical and utterly subjective, really, in the end. At number 3, I argued again for Newton, this time his explicit treatise called The Method of Fluxions, by which he set out the infinitesimal calculus, revolutionizing so much of science and technology. The book was finished in 1671, but not published until 1736. This suggestion received 4 votes of agreement. At number 4, I proposed, bending the rules a little, that both Newcomen and Watt hold their invention of the steam engine jointly, which invention began what I might term our industrial revolution, which appears to be so powering our nation to greater and greater heights of productivity. Here, too, a majority agreed, we all allowing that these stupendous marvels could not be allowed to descend any further in the rankings. At number 5, I proposed Richard Arkwright's water frame, a type of automatic spinning machine which produced vast quantities of cotton thread, first completed in 1769, and which was highly influential in creating the entire modern English textile factory. Historian Gibbon proposed Hume's History of the English People, for the number 5 spot, but since the other 3 members agreed with me, yet again, Richard Arkwright's Waterframe carried the day at number 5. Number 6. Here, although Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations couldn't be delayed any longer, only 2 of 4 agreed, but since a tie is won by the House, I prevailed yet again. Smith, of course, revolutionized economics in making us all understand that, for the most part, both parties to an economic exchange prosper, not just one. The pie can become bigger and bigger. Who would reject a pie that grows bigger and bigger and bigger? Number 7. Now, I wanted to put the discovery of hydrogen by Henry Cavendish in 1766 at number 7, but I was denied here with only 1 agreeing. Instead, our company voted, yet again, another textile invention, Edmund Cartwright's power loom, invented just 9 years ago in 1784, which is transforming the entire industry. It allows the warp and weft of threads to be joined together quickly and automatically. At number 8, the company acceded to my prior request to put here the discovery of hydrogen by Cavendish. At number 9, we all agreed that Cook's voyages from 68 to 79 were a stupendous navigational and scientific achievement. He, by observing the transit of Venus from the South Seas, was able to precisely ascertain the distance of the Earth to the Sun, and also, when moving westward, discovering New Zealand and Australia, mapping much of the Pacific Ocean. Not bad at all for number 9. And finally, number 10. Here we had many choices, among them Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, Gibbon's Decline and Fall, our own Burke's Reflection on the Revolution in France, and fourthly, I myself strenuously arguing for Locke's second treatise on government, his highly influential work of political philosophy at number 10. However, by a narrow margin, the committee decided to let Jethro Tull's invention of the seed drill drawn behind a horse, which allowed farmers quickly and automatically to plant their seeds at a definite depth, raising crops in uniform rows as well, and thus allowing much quicker weeding between the rows. This took the final spot, understandable perhaps, given that it was an integral part of our agricultural revolution of the 18th century. Now, if we turn our gaze to contemplate other acts of human accomplishment and achievement in your own 20th century and proceeding backwards through much of recorded history, even to 800 BC, we encounter today an enormous accomplishment in and of itself, Charles Murray's human accomplishment, the pursuit of excellence in the arts and sciences, 800 BC to 1950. In this, Murray surveys cultural achievements worldwide to find those that define human greatness in the arts and sciences, ranking them by their importance while teasing out numerous additional historical insights about the processes of invention and creation. Murray begins by noting indeed how many accomplishments we humans have achieved as we entered the modern age, saying, on every dimension, the last half-dozen centuries in particular brought sensational improvement which, with qualifications, continues to this day. If you are in doubt, ask yourself a question. Can you think of any earlier moment in history in which you would prefer to live your life? He means, of course, not that visiting Renaissance Italy or revolutionary France might not be interesting, but that from the point of view of your general happiness and well-being, would you really choose to live before the invention of antibiotics, and antiseptic and anesthetic surgery, and safe and rapid transportation from the local grocery store to the most distant country? Murray starts his survey around 8000 BC, recounting the beginning of agriculture, the domestication of livestock and animals, and soon the acquisition of astronomical knowledge. Fast forward to 1000 BC, when writing became more ubiquitous and archaeological records clearer. And, quite astonishingly, when we find that the Greeks around this time had constructed the so-called Antikythera mechanism, an actual analog computer made of bronze with differential gears that could, upon moving, very accurately predict many as astronomical events, such as lunar cycles and eclipses. This sublime piece of technology was not equaled in the West until the 14th century, over 2 millennia later, and shows how advanced Greek mechanical engineering, mathematics, and astronomy were. Also deserving of mention, of course, were the Egyptians, with the alignment of the Great Pyramid with the cardinal points of the compass nearly perfect, an average error for each face of less than 0.02%. If we proceed to the Romans, we find them, of course, highly competent in administration and engineering, building a magnificent road system and public works, such as the Colosseum and the Baths of Caracalla, this last covering an area about half again as large as the ground area of the U.S. Capitol building. But regarding the arts and sciences, they, unlike the Greeks, had little new to offer, and in the cutting words of Edwin Gibbon, were peopled by a race of pygmies. So overall, in medicine, little progress was made, and the largest single category of medication in the Roman pharmacy was said to be antitoxins. After giving us a brief tour as well of the highly accomplished Chinese civilization as a warm-up, Murray now turns to his main task at hand, which is to A, find the most important or significant events in the historical progress of all the arts and sciences, and B, to find which artists and scientists were responsible for these. In order to do this, he decides not to try to evaluate all these areas of knowledge himself, but instead to rely on adding up all the number of mentions in various books, such as encyclopedias, dictionaries, and surveys that discuss these achievements. And so in the end, he relies on the collected wisdom of other scientists, artists, critics, and thinkers to see how many thought that Newton's or Michelangelo's or Aristotle's achievements were important. We just add them all up to obtain a kind of reputational measure, which, when done properly, should be of some use. However, it's important to note in addition that Murray, before choosing to rely on experts, does make his own broad choices as well, thus rejecting books by postmodernist critics who believe that the silly art of Andy Warhol has much value or that the ugly music of John Cage musical merit. Instead, he uses the art histories of those who believe in representational art and reject modern atonal music for the nightmare of ugliness that it is. Having outlined his methodology and incidentally pointed out that for some Eastern art traditions the artists remain anonymous, adding difficulty in assessing responsibility, Murray then goes through the relevant literature, adds up the results, and statistically organizes them by significant events and significant figures. A significant figure is everyone who is mentioned in at least 50% of the qualified sources. Murray gets in total over 4,000 historically significant figures. Let's now proceed through the various areas, seeing whose reputations are the greatest. Number 1, astronomy. We've got 1 to 5, Galileo, Kepler, the obscure but highly prolific American William Herschel, Laplace, who expanded our understanding of our solar system, and Copernicus. Number 2, biology. Here we've got Darwin, Aristotle, Lamarck, Cuvier, and Morgan, who originated the chromosome theory of genetic inheritance. Number 3, chemistry, 1 to 5, Lavoisier, because he first understood the conservation of matter and established quantitative chemistry. Berzelius, Scheele, Priestley, who discovered oxygen, and Davy, electrochemistry founder. Number 4, physics. Newton, who just edges out Einstein. Then Rutherford, who discovered uranium radiation and conducted the first experimental nuclear reaction. Faraday, who discovered you can create electricity by changing magnets. And Galileo. Number 5, mathematics. Leonard Euler, partly because he was so incredibly prolific, producing 19 volumes of results. Then Newton, because of his co-invention of calculus. Then Euclid, primarily because he was the great synthesizer of geometry. Then Carl Gauss, who makes number 4 because of his brilliance, even though he published relatively little, his motto being few but ripe. And finally, Fermat of the famous Fermat's last theorem. Number 6, medicine. Pasteur, for discovering pasteurization, vaccines, and developing germ theory. Robert Koch, who discovered the bacillus for cholera, anthrax, and tuberculosis. Hippocrates, the father of medicine. Galen, the brilliant Roman experimentalist. And finally, Paracelsus, for developing toxicology, and who made a beginning in chemotherapy. Number 7, technology. James Watt at number 1 for the steam engine. Edison, number 2. Leonardo, number 3. Huygens, number 4, the great polymath for improving optical glasses and watches. And number 5, Archimedes for the screw pump, lever, and pulley, all of which he improved. Murray then creates separate indexes for combined sciences, Chinese philosophy, and Indian philosophy. In Western philosophy, we get 1 to 5 Aristotle, Plato, Kant, Descartes, and Hegel. In Western music, we get Beethoven just edging out Mozart by a whisker, then Bach, Handel, and Haydn. Next, he covers Chinese painting and Japanese art. On Western visual art, 1 to 5, we have Michelangelo, Picasso, Raphael, Leonardo, and Titian. In literature, we get indexes of Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. Then for Western literature, 1 to 5, we get Shakespeare, Goethe, Dante, Virgil, and Homer. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Hugo are 10th, 11th, and 13th. As he says about some of the authors being placed too high, one can expect to hear cries of indignation. What is Rousseau doing in 6th place? Voltaire in 7th, Byron in 9th, Scott in 19th. He says that this occurred because, A, in the cases of Rousseau and Voltaire, the ratings partly reflect their combined fiction and nonfiction. In addition, B, the history of literature often reflects not just the greatness of an author, but also their influence, including authors of fiction, on social and political movements. The Enlightenment in the case of Rousseau and Voltaire, the Romantic movement in the case of Byron and Scott. This tendency contaminates the Western Literature Index as a representation of purely literary excellence, but it appropriately reflects the way in which Western literature has been intertwined with politics and society. Among the very elite, the top 30 from all indexes, he says, what can we make of these 30 people? All are male. Among the 14 in the scientific inventories, which have worldwide coverage, all but 1 are from Europe. Edison is the lone exception. 2 people qualified in 2 indexes, Aristotle in biology and Western philosophy, and Newton in physics and the combined scientific index. Of the 30, just 3, Confucius, Hippocrates, and Aristotle, lived prior to Christ, and just 6 lived in the first 1,400 years after Christ. 18 of the remaining 21 who came after 1400 were concentrated in the 3 centuries from 1600 to 1900. In philosophy, Aristotle is number 1 because some of Plato's final conclusions, especially regarding the role of the state, are totalitarian. In contrast, Aristotle's understandings of virtue, the nature of a civilized polity, happiness, and human nature have not only survived but have become so integral a part of Western culture that to be European or American and hold mainstream values on these issues is to be an Aristotelian. The influence on culture of philosophy, he argues, is shown by the fact that if we subtract Confucius, Sankara, and Aristotle, each of the three civilizations in which they lived would be profoundly changed. Subtract Michelangelo, Shakespeare, and Beethoven, and the effect might be hard to notice. In Chapter 9, The Events That Matter, Murray turns from significant figures to significant events, saying only 1,560, about 1 out of 5, were mentioned in at least 50% of the sources. Of these, Murray selects a subset and calls them central events. Let's review the central events in just one area, astronomy, to see their importance, date of discovery, and country of origin. 140 AD, Alexandria. Ptolemy's Almagest constructs a model of a geocentric solar system that accurately predicts the movements of the planets. 1514, Poland. Nicholas Copernicus's Commentariolus is the first statement of the heliocentric theory. It culminates in the publication of De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium in 1543. 1572, Denmark. Tycho Brahe records the first European observation of a supernova, discrediting the Aristotelian system of fixed sphere of stars. 1608, the Netherlands. Hans Lippershey and Zacharias Jensen independently invent a crude telescope. 1609, Italy. Galileo conducts the first telescopic observations of the night sky, transforming the nature of astronomical investigation. 1609, Italy. Galileo constructs the first working telescope, 9x magnification initially, improved to 30x by the end of the year. 1610, Italy. Galileo discovers 4 moons of Jupiter and infers that the Earth is not the center of all motion. 1814, Germany. Joseph von Fraunhofer discovers that spectral lines observed in light reflected from the planets are shared, while light from the stars contains differing lines, leading to the development of astronomical spectroscopy. 1918, USA. Harlow Shapley determines the center of the galaxy, providing a correct picture of our own galaxy, plus the first accurate estimate of its size. 1924, USA. Edwin Hubble determines that Andromeda is a galaxy, revolutionizing the understanding of the universe's size and structure. 1929, USA. Edwin Hubble discovers Hubble's law, introducing the concept of an expanding universe. And 1932, USA. Edwin Hubble discovers Carl Jansky detects radio waves from space, founding radio astronomy. And there our astronomical list of central events, the most significant of the significant events, ends. Murray proceeds to do the exact same thing to all the other aforementioned subjects: biology, chemistry, the earth sciences, physics, mathematics, medicine, and technology. In the arts, however, he does not offer such a listing, saying, the techniques that work for measuring the eminence of artists do not work for measuring the importance of specific artistic creations. The reasons he gives are at least threefold. A, because oftentimes in books on art, a given work is presented because it's representative of a genre, but being representative of a genre doesn't mean it's particularly good. Secondly, B, given that each artist produces much more art than a great scientist produces new inventions or discoveries, there is far less chance that books will choose to highlight the same work of art from one artist than they do the great work of a scientist. And C,
because fashion in art seems to be more malleable than fashions in science, making the judgment of art critics perhaps less reliable. And so Murray concludes by saying, while it would be great fun if I could give you lists of the top paintings or novels, I cannot, nor can I give you any other means by which you can compare War and Peace's place in the pantheon of novels with that of Middlemarch, or see exactly how far down the list Pachelbel's canon stands. Having confessed his puzzlement as to how we might rate and compare artistic works, Murray next turns to the issue of meta-inventions. Meta-inventions are defined as the introduction of a new cognitive tool for dealing with the world around us. Important meta-inventions, in his opinion, would be A. Language, started independently in Sumer, Egypt, Mexico, and China. B. Artistic realism, started perhaps briefly by the Egyptians under Pharaoh Akhenaton, and then a millennium later coming into its own with the Greeks. C. Linear perspective, originated primarily by Filippo Brunelleschi around 1412, which revolutionized painting. D. Polyphony in music, meaning the combination of two or more melodies in a piece. E. The invention of drama, allegedly in 534 BC by the poet Thespis, and brought to classical perfection by the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and the comedies of Aristophanes. F. The novel, although having a few early examples like Don Quixote and the Tale of the Genji, really only coming into its own starting in 18th century England. G. Meditation, migrating in the 20th century from east to west. H. Logic, perhaps the greatest meta-invention of them all. I. Arabic numerals, taken primarily by Muslims from Indian mathematicians. J. Mathematical proofs, first invented by the brilliant polymath Thales around 600 BC. K. Probability theory, by mathematicians Fermat and Blaise Pascal around 1650. L. The secular observation of nature, perhaps first done and recorded by Thales, of erosion and magnetism. And finally, M. The scientific method, whose emergence Murray dates from about the period from Galileo to Newton. Murray concludes by now looking at all the lists he's compiled and asking dozens of intriguing questions about the data he's so laboriously assembled. 3 of these questions are, number 1, whether certain regional cultures have been more productive than others. 2, whether, and if so, why, women are highly unrepresented in most of the lists. And 3, the nature of modern Jewish success in the arts and sciences. As Murray says, the rapid pace at which Jews entered the inventories as soon as the barriers were even partially lifted is astonishing. Let's take these 3 questions one by one. First, on whether some regional cultures are more successful than others. The reality is that 97% of accomplishment in the scientific inventories occurred in Europe and North America. Another way of saying that is that the 10 people with the most index entries are, in order, Aristotle, Newton, Copernicus, Galileo, Darwin, Ptolemy, Kepler, Descartes, Euclid, and Archimedes. And in music, the lack of a tradition of named composers in non-Western civilizations means that the Western total of 522 significant figures has no real competition at all. Which countries, cities, and regions have been the most productive per capita, having the highest density of genius? From 1400 to 1600, in art, France, Belgium, and Italy. In literature, London and northern Italy. In music, northern France, Belgium, Paris, and Italy. And in science, overwhelmingly, Italy and Germany. From 1600 to 1800, in art, northern France and the Netherlands. In literature, Paris, London, and Germany. In music, Germany and Italy. and in science, overwhelmingly England, Paris, and parts of Germany. Finally, from 1800 to 1950. In art, Paris, Belgium, the Netherlands, and London. In literature, London, Paris, Germany, and Belgium. In music, Paris, Italy, and Germany. And in science, much of England, Paris, the Netherlands, and Germany. These areas, during these periods, were the per capita Western champions. Secondly, with regard to women in the sciences and arts. The first to appear is the Greek poet Sappho of Lesbos in the 6th century, the negative 6th century BC. 1,000 years later comes the next woman, the natural philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria, who lived from about 370 to 415. Another 13 women appear between Hypatia and 1600, but all of them are confined to just one domain, literature. When it comes to the sciences, it took a long time for women to get access to the universities, even longer than it took for Jews. When they did, over the last 150 years, there's been an increase from about 2 significant female figures to 19. But the stark reality remains that, despite the vastly increased access, and even of affirmative action in favor of women presently in the West, the percentage of women getting Nobels in the sciences and literature is smaller in the second half of the 20th century than it was in the first half. Why this should be the case involves many potential reasons, which Murray discusses at length. Thirdly, Jews. Like women, Jews increasingly in the 19th century were finally granted access both to European and American society and their universities, and the consequence was the greatest sustained output of human creativity and productivity by any single ethnic group the world has ever seen. Before the 19th century, there were only, before the 19th century, there were only a few like Spinoza, Montaigne, and Maimonides. But from that point onwards, in science, we got Einstein, Niels Bohr, Robert Oppenheimer, John von Neumann, and Richard Feynman. In music, we got Jacques Offenbach, Gustav Mahler, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Leonard Bernstein, and Stephen Sondheim. In the performing arts, on the piano, Rubinstein, Horowitz, Sirkin, Schnabel, and Argerich. On the violin, Jascha Heifetz, Itzhak Perlman, Isaac Stern, and Fritz Kreisler. And on in practically every single field of human endeavor. By how much did Jews outperform everyone else on average? Murray measures from 1870 onwards, when they constituted about 2% of the population of the United States and Europe. In every case except astronomy, Jews are disproportionately represented. In philosophy, 14 to 1, in mathematics, 12 to 1, and in physics, 9 to 1, and medicine, 8 to 1. From 1870 to 1950 in Germany, they were overrepresented 22 to 1, in France, 19 to 1, in Britain, 8 to 1, and in the US, 5 to 1. And since Jews got increasingly societal and educational access as the 20th century progressed, they received more Nobels per capita in the second half than the first. At 2% of the population, they got 14% of all Nobels in literature and the sciences in the first half, but 29% in the second half. Incidentally, Murray notes that in 1954, a psychologist took advantage of New York City's universal IQ testing to identify all 28 children with measured IQs of 170 or higher. How many were Jews? 24 of 28. So wrapping up, what do I think of this book? I fell in love with it, since you can learn so much about the nature and course of civilization by studying and understanding his many indexes, and also by using them as a starting point for further internet research. I'd give it an A+, one notch from perfection. That having been said, there are still numerous points of disagreement or potential disagreement with Murray. Let's review a few of these. Number 1. First, there are other important civilizational areas that one could tabulate as well. He's sadly directly refusing to rank military accomplishment, saying putting defeated Hitler on the human resume is too much like putting beat my drug habit on a personal one. This is absurd since, for example, Wellington defeating Bonaparte was one of the greatest English individual and national achievements ever. Similarly, one could create political rankings of statesmen as well, which would be highly valuable. Number 2, there is a crucial issue that he leaves unresolved. And we can see what that is if we were to construct a political ranking for any given statesman or politician. So we could judge a statesman in 2 ways. First, on how good he is in accomplishing whatever he wants to accomplish. And secondly, by what he wanted to accomplish, his ends, his goals. So, for example, in general, the founding fathers of the United States had the right ends or goals in wanting to create a society unequaled in its protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But they were also competent in achieving those ends as well. But Hitler, on the other hand, as a statesman, from his own point of view, was certainly extremely proficient, at least for a time, in his methods of brinksmanship and war in achieving his ends. But his ends were horrendous. So he gets high marks in one area, but very low marks in another. But the same can be said of artists. Some artists, from their own point of view, like Picasso or Stravinsky, are great in achieving what they want. But Stravinsky and Picasso's goals were often artistic ugliness. So Picasso or Stravinsky, or anyone who deliberately creates ugly art, is, I would argue, the artistic equivalent of Hitler. So we have to remember that Murray's indexes only track what other people regard as important, but have no necessary connection with beauty at all. So, for example, in his musical indexes, he almost completely leaves out Sergei Rachmaninoff, a composer who I would certainly put in the top 10 and maybe top 5 of all composers for both greatness and beauty. It's not surprising that Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto is regarded as one of the most beautiful and popular pieces in the modern repertoire. And so Murray's musical index, that gives Beethoven and Mozart 100 total points and Rachmaninoff only 7, ranking him below Jean-Jacques Rousseau as a musician, who gets 8 points, is again aesthetically worthless. So when he says that one way of knowing whether the scores I present are meaningful is to ask whether the results possess face validity, I would answer that giving Rachmaninoff 7 points and Mozart and Beethoven 100 has 0 face validity. Number 3. Murray's general method of using biographies, encyclopedias, dictionaries, and other sources certainly is a good first step, being a type of popular peer review. But in the end, consensus does not establish truth. It only shows what others regard as important. In music, for example, you would have to construct a more objective measure of musical value, but we don't have one now. All we have is our gut feelings. We don't know why certain melodies and harmonies create emotion and why some are beautiful. And until we do, an index of popularity and importance, such as Murray gives us in music, really can't be that definitive. Just a first step. So when he says, while I am free not to enjoy the music of Richard Wagner, it is silly for me to argue that Richard Wagner does not deserve his standing as one of the greatest composers. I would point out that those who loved Wagner, like Adolf Hitler, don't have any objective confirmation of their feelings either. Number 4. It's not clear why he didn't create an index for psychology. Number 5, Murray says a new wife of the 18th century had to enter upon childbearing, knowing that she must face odds of about 1 in 20 of dying in each childbirth herself. This is mistaken. The reality is that having 5 children, a woman in the 18th century had about a 5 to 6% chance of dying from all those 5 births altogether. Number 6, he ranks Gregor Mendel 18th among biologists, which seems low. Apparently, Mendel is penalized because no one discovered his discovery of genetic inheritance for so long, thus rendering it culturally unimportant. That seems wrong and a weakness in Murray's method. Number 7, he wants to argue that Christianity was partly responsible for Western accomplishments, saying the Greeks had the foundation, but it was the transmutation of that foundation by Christianity that gave modern Europe its impetus and differentiated European accomplishment from that of all other cultures around the world. But I would argue that A, the main point is that it was a step backwards from the Greeks. B, the less Christian Western civ became, the more successful scientifically it became. And C, the role of the Catholic Church was to stifle science, and that's one reason why Protestant countries, which are less religiously Christian, are at least 3 times more successful than Catholic in collecting Nobel Prizes. He also claims that in Christianity, eternal salvation is not reserved for those who renounce the world, but is available to all who believe and act accordingly. But the same can be said of Islam, and Islam's a scientific basket case. The reality instead was that it was, as he admits, the knowledge transmitted from the Greeks, and also the legal institution of property rights law inherited from the Romans that laid the foundation for Western greatness, not Christianity. And with that, we finally accomplished our review of human accomplishment. Happy for my part to live in a country that presently represents the epitome of greatness in the sciences, technology, literature, industry, and perhaps even in ethics as well, with our ever-increasing campaigns to eradicate the slave trade. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.